Welcome to Litpoetry, the podcast where we go on a journey of discovery, reading, analyzing, and discussing great poetry from around the world. Poetry is worth it because the reading and writing of poetry is a revolutionary act that has the potential to transform both the reader and our world.
Welcome to the Lit Poetry Podcast Season 2. In today's episode, we'll be discussing a poem by the East Timorese poet Esteviana Amaral, entitled Foho-Lolon Haklalak. This is the first poem we are featuring here at Lit Poetry in a language other than English. In this case, we'll be listening to the poem in the main native-speaking tongue spoken in Timor-Leste, called Tetum. This is a really powerful poem that lifts the lid on the environmental problems brought on by climate change that now beset countries that are situated closer to the equator like Timor-Leste. It's a poem that challenges Westerners to understand the serious consequences of their lifestyles and how their lifestyles and their actions and their lack of urgency in addressing global issues of climate change are impacting on the lives of others. This poem was suggested to me by former First Lady of Timor-Leste, Kirsty Sorgusimo, who will be joining us shortly on the podcast to discuss both the poem, the poet, and the issues the poem raises. So let's take a listen to the poem, but before I play you the beautiful Tetum recording of this piece, read by the wonderful Evangelina Soares Gama, I just want to quickly read the poem to you in English so that you have a better understanding of its content. In English it's called Cheer to the Mountainside. The dew is starting to disappear from the flat leaves. The breeze's calming rhythm embraces the body atop Mount Marabia. Dili's beauty is like a star in the sky when night falls. The leaves of the Bilad and Lahane plains let out a cheer when the rains come, refreshing the springs in the heat of midday. Springs that are counting the days of the dry and the end of everything. Springs that are full to overflowing with rain. The dry has swallowed all beauty. We burn and fell trees arbitrarily. Creatures lose their nests and become wild. When the rains come, they carry the dry earth from the mountainside to the plains. Some complain about the loss of their homes. Some complain about the loss of clean water. Some complain about the shortage of water. Who actually is to blame here? Me, you, him, them, you or us? We will keep pointing our fingers at one another. Who actually is to blame? Who is going to fix this?
Foho-Lolon Haklalak, Kusi Esteviana Amaral. Mahuen hahu mihis ihai taham belar. Aning horitmu hakmate kase ising. Ia foho tutu marabia. Idilin ya fura kanesan fitung ia lalehang bahira kalan to'o. Ai tahang iha laletek bali dino lahane haklalak wahira udang munurai. Hafresku matang iha meudia bot. Matang nebe sura holorong. Bai lorong to'o bot hotu laikona. Matang nebe hafresku matang mau to udabeng. Bailoron tolang furakotu, liman sanak sunu no tesi ayar biru. Baladalah konya knuuk no hahufui. Bahira udan to'o, belori raimarang iha foho-lolong butu kihatetu. Ema balu halerik lakong helafating, ema balu halerik menus bemos, balu halerik be hahu menus. Selos maksala ihane. Hau, o, nia, sira, imi ho ami. Ita sena fating hatudu limang bamalu. Selos maksala, selos maksehadia.
So welcome back to the podcast. Kirsty Sword-Gusamo is an activist, single mum, former First Lady of Timor-Leste, author, lover of languages, and pin-up spy. In 2001, Kirsty founded the Alola Foundation, a not-for-profit organisation which strives to improve the lives of women and girls in Timor-Leste. The foundation's motto is Strong Women, Strong Nation, and it has a strong record of enabling girls to complete their secondary schooling, as well as contributing to a dramatic reduction in the rates of infant mortality through promotion of exclusive breastfeeding, family planning and immunisation. Kirsty continues to chair the Alola Foundation, which has been lauded for its work in the areas of education, advocacy, economic empowerment and maternal and child health. In 2015, Kirsty was appointed as an Officer of the Order of Australia for her distinguished service to Australian East Timorese relations through the development of mutual cooperation and understanding, particularly in the education sector. She was also awarded the Order of Timor-Leste in May 2016 for her significant contribution to Timor-Leste's independence struggle and the well-being of its people. Kirsty now lives in Melbourne with her 3 teenage sons. So welcome, Kirsty. It's great to have you here on the podcast.
Oh, great. Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to have you. It's actually been, I think, probably a decade since we've actually spoken face-to-face, even though it's over a screen. So it's pretty delightful to see you after this long period of time, I think.
It is. It's wonderful to reconnect over such a lovely, objective, a lovely project.
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic project, and you've given me a fantastic opportunity to actually get a voice of an artist who perhaps, I imagine in Timor it's a bit of a struggle to really take an art like poetry and to get much purchase with it and certainly make a livelihood. And I imagine that a big part of it's done with great passion. And for the belief in the actual poetry itself. Look, that might be a pretty good place to start, actually. I suppose the questions I have for you are, for a young poetess in Timor trying to hone her craft, what sort of opportunities would somebody like Esteviana actually have? And you know her clearly, so if you could tell us a little bit about her and her work and just the obstacles for women in Timor writing and practicing the arts, it would be great.
Sure. So I actually have never met Esteviana apart from over the internet. I came across her works actually just quite by chance, really. Last year I was working for the Ministry of Education of Timor-Leste on learning materials for the basic education curriculum, which is sort of basically years sort of 6 to 9, and there was a unit of work on poetry, and so I had quite a big job actually dredging up information about poets and actually poems themselves. And I'm not quite sure how it happened, but I came across her Facebook profile and a link to her blog, on which she has published quite a large number of poems and also short stories. And I really loved them, and many of them were very sort of topical, very relevant. There were a few sort of short stories on love themes that I thought would appeal to Timorese youth. So I wrote to her to ask her permission whether I could use some of her stories, including a couple of poems. And she wrote back very enthusiastically, because I think, for most people working in the literature field, there's, next to little chance of actually making a living or of actually having any sort of recognition at all for your work. So she was very chuffed that I had taken the time to be in touch with her, and even more delighted that I liked her work. So of course she responded with great enthusiasm to the idea of me including some of her poems in the national curriculum of Timor-Leste. Yeah, so when you reached out to me, I was actually in a fairly good position to sort of suggest, a couple of ideas for poems because of that research that I had done last year. Now, having said that, there are a couple of other, better known, higher profile poets, all of whom are men. And, I could very well have taken one of their poems, but I like the idea of actually focusing attention on the work of a young Timorese woman. I believe Esteviana's in her early 30s, and someone, who hasn't previously had any attention whatsoever.
Look, from my perspective, I was really, really keen on honing in on a young woman or middle-aged woman who's writing poetry, because having spent time in Timor, I'm well aware that there is probably a little bit of a gender disparity in terms of opportunities, and your work with Alola Foundation. So for our listeners, Alola Foundation supports women in the pursuit of empowerment and on multiple levels. Could you tell us a little bit about Alola and maybe how your work with Alola sort of connects with this thought to promote women in literature?
Sure. So I established Alola 20 years ago this year, and the name actually Alola comes from the name of a young woman called Juliana dos Santos, whose nickname was Alola, and Juliana was kidnapped by a militia leader in the violence following the referendum in 1999 and taken across the border as a kind of war trophy and sex slave by the said militia leader. She actually remains in West Timor, sadly, today for a range of rather complex political and sort of psychological reasons. But out of the experience of sort of advocating on her behalf and trying to ensure that she at least had an opportunity to meet again with her bereaved parents, who just shortly before her kidnapping had lost their only son to the same militia group. He was murdered by them. And so that family reunion did take place, but as I said, Juliana decided to remain in West Timor. So she has borne children to her captor, and it's a really very sad story that's kind of very emblematic, really, of the situation of women, particularly during conflict, where they are really very much the first to suffer. But, Timorese society is a very patriarchal society, and that experience of working on behalf of Juliana, advocating for her, sort of made me very conscious that there were very many hundreds or thousands of Julianas across Timor-Leste, and maybe not having experienced quite such extreme violations, but who are nevertheless, struggling to be heard, struggling to have their rights to dignity and to a good life realised. So I set up Alola. It has 4 main pillars, which are economic empowerment, education, advocacy, and maternal and child health. So we established the first association to promote exclusive breastfeeding, which continues today to be responsible for the really very high rates of exclusive breastfeeding across the country.
Yeah, and it's a largely female-run organisation too, isn't it, in all the positions and advocacy and... That's right.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah, so all of the managers, bar one, are females. The CEOs, successive CEOs, have all been female, and I'm very proud of, how Alola has become, apart from everything else it does, become a bit of a breeding ground for female leadership.
So has that sort of cascaded into other parts of society? People, some of the women from Alola have then gone on to work elsewhere with some of the skills they've developed?
Absolutely, yep. So the first CEO now works for UN Women. The CEO that followed her now works in the Prime Minister's office on gender-sensitive budgeting. So, yeah, there certainly has been a leaping off point for them all.
Yeah, my partner worked there. We lived in Timor for about a year, and she absolutely loved it. And I think it was particularly the culture and the vibe, the atmosphere of that place. And I imagine that's part of its strength, that, there's this sort of environment that you can nurture young women in that empowerment. Would that be the case?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first two CEOs actually had joined the organisation when they were just sort of newly graduated from university. In fact, I think the first one hadn't even finished her studies because they'd been interrupted due to the violence in 1999. So they came in with very little work experience and just their passion and their drive and motivation. And so to see them blossom as women, as managers, as leaders, not just leaders of the organisation, but, leaders of the women's movement in Timor-Leste, was just so gratifying and so rewarding.
I bet it was. So, look, before we talk about the poem, it might be good just to segue here into... I'm a little bit in the darker, so it's been a while since I've been to Timor. And certainly with COVID-19 and the pandemic around the world, I think countries are largely obsessed with themselves and their own little what's happening around them. I feel a little bit on the outer of what's really happening on the ground in Timor, but I would trust that you would have your finger on the pulse there. It would be really great to sort of it would be great to hear what's actually been the effects of the pandemic in Timor-Leste. So if you give us an update about that would be so useful and wonderful.
Sure. So Timor-Leste actually sort of cruised through 2020 and the initial phase of the pandemic quite well. It does share a border, of course, with West Timor, so there was a lot of effort early on to secure that border and to make sure there was no illegal border crossings from Indonesia, because, of course, Indonesia has had huge case numbers and has really struggled to manage the crisis. However, I think the highest number of cases throughout 2020 was something like 24 deaths in total, and really just a couple of hundred positive cases. That changed this year with the arrival of the Delta strain, and given that conditions in most homes in terms of ability for basic hand hygiene, often houses have got nuclear family plus numerous extended family members living under one roof. So, social distancing and things, limiting social contact amongst affected people was really very difficult to enforce. So the country has been in and out of lockdown this year. There have been, I think, less than 100 deaths still, but the case numbers have been much higher this year. There have been, as I mentioned, lockdowns and also restrictions on movement across the country, which has imposed really serious hardship on people, particularly, small traders who rely on being able to get their products to market in another far-flung capital. Not being able to travel around has meant really severe economic hardship for those people. Schools, of course, have been closed down until quite recently. So really, really very difficult, compounded by the fact that, there's been a degree of political instability in Timor over the last couple of years. So, not an easy scenario, even at the best of times. Closure of the borders, of course, has meant that the tiny little fledgling tourism industry just came to a grinding halt too. So medium to large scale businesses
Sure.
also have suffered
so
tremendously.
Restaurants and touring companies and all that sort of stuff, there's just been nothing for them at all, I imagine.
No, the government did promote a domestic tourism strategy for a period of time, encouraging Timorese to visit places in their own country, and I think that's been gone some of the way towards promoting just I guess just survival economies for people working in that area, but it won't be until really international tourism resumes that those businesses will be able to take off again.
Well, it's very, very fascinating to get a snapshot of what's happening on the ground. In terms of immunisation into the country, has Australia been sending anything over? Do you know?
Yes. Australia, from quite early on, was donating lots of doses of AstraZeneca in particular, because it's a largely youthful population. About 80% of the country are in the very lowest age bracket. So a lot of people hesitated to take AstraZeneca. I believe that Pfizer is now available as well. And actually, I'm not sure exactly what the percentage rates of vaccination are, but they're quite significant. I think the health system there has actually done quite a good job at promoting vaccination and getting supply out to some of the more remote areas. Having said that, I think it's still a challenge, and the country still needs to work harder, because I think we've all realised that that's the only way we're getting out of this crisis anytime soon.
All right. Well, let's think about the poem for a bit now. Look, I've certainly read my own culture and values into the poem, and I think I feel a weight of accusation with environmental issues and how they affect other countries. And I understand that this poem is actually not just about looking out at other countries; it's actually internal as well. So we might touch upon that. It seems to me to be a very rich environmental poem, and it brings up alarming questions in me. It's particularly some of the context, like even just over the last year, there's been the terrible, what were they last year? The terrible floods in
floods earlier this year in April, yeah.
And if people actually see the video of this poem that's on the Litpoetry channel, they'll see some footage taken, and it's really horrific footage. So I suppose that's the question I would like to ask you, Kirsty, about the state of environmental affairs in Timor, and about what this poem perhaps says about this issue, and what would be going on perhaps in Esteviana's mind in penning this poem.
Yeah, look, whether she had the concept, the idea, the reality of climate change in her mind when she wrote it, or whether she was just very mindful of the impacts of the extended period of the dry, and the dry season in Timor does render the environment very brittle and very fragile. I mean, I think what I loved most about the poem was that the places that she described in it are very familiar to me, having lived in Delhi for 15 years and having travelled past Mount Marabia on my way to Dare in the hills where I used to live for a long time. It really, apart from anything else, made me very, very homesick for the country that I call my second home. But certainly she would be very aware that there is constantly debate amongst politicians, when a natural disaster like the flooding happens, that, there is a whole lot of finger pointing that goes on, that there's lots of complaints from people about, lack of water, lack of clean water, and how it gets, an issue like that gets turned into a bit of a political football. I think probably when she, in her final line of the poem, says, who is going to fix this? I think she's probably thinking at a local level, like whose responsibility is this in government? But of course, one can extrapolate and say, there's a much bigger concern here. Who's responsible for climate change, and who is going to do something about that? Are we going to keep pointing at the politicians and say it's you, or are we going to accept collective responsibility for this?
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense to me. And there's the line, who's to blame here? Me, you, him, them, you, or us. So there is that wider picture of the political events that are shaping these environmental catastrophes, but also it comes back to the local very much. And that's a lovely thing about the poem, I think. It's deeply personal, but it's also got this wider gaze as well, and it's trying to weigh it all up and trying to work out where to go. Is that the same sort of sense you're getting? That?
Yes, absolutely, absolutely.
And so maybe you could tell us a little bit about, because it's, we're talking about a different culture here, which you're a lot more familiar with than myself, of course. The lines that come through about, some complain, you mentioned before, and then some complain of this, some complain of that. How does the culture function in Timor when there are big events like the Easter floods and that sort of thing?
Well, people who are affected by these sorts of national disasters are usually the most fragile, vulnerable sections of the community, ones living in insecure housing, in areas of Dili that are prone to flooding, probably because they can't afford to live anywhere else. Ones, living with large numbers of extended family, hence, huge impact when one house gets flooded. The number of people affected is disastrously high. So I think the thing that really amazed everybody, and not amazed everybody, that really delighted everybody, was that given that there's Timor is so isolated, as most countries around the world are in the current situation, there was a tremendous effort from community groups that spontaneously just banded together. So young people, students, there was a group of hospitality workers who got together and put together food parcels and food deliveries for those worst affected by the floods. So, there were efforts internationally as well to raise funds, but the thing that really delighted and, to some extent surprised people, because there has been a little bit of sense that, when something like this happens, that you basically wait for the government to step in and to help. And as I mentioned, there has been a bit of instability within government and within political spheres. So I think on this occasion, everyone thought, well, we've learnt not to actually sit down and wait for government to step in and to assist us. We're going to take the lead here and actually do something ourselves to respond to this crisis. So in spite of all that economic hardship that I mentioned earlier, that made, this response, this solidarity, all the more admirable and amazing.
Yeah, that groundswell of
quite a
activity,
lovely thing to witness.
Coming together of people. Yeah, it sounds terrific thing indeed, and perhaps coming from the history where the UN was there and trying to rebuild Dili and the country from scratch, and being dependent on these powers that sort of come in, but now this self-empowerment that's becoming a part of the fabric of society. That's a pretty exciting thing, I think, in Timor. And it's curious indeed. Because you sent me two poems to actually have a look at, and I chose this one to work up. The other one though was kind of connects with what you're saying, because it was quite a scathing look at politicians, I think, and the government and corruption and things like that. So is that also the sentiment perhaps in the people a little bit?
Yeah, look, I guess so Timor-Leste celebrates 20 years as an independent nation next year, and of course there's much to celebrate and much to be proud of. Rebuilding a country from ground zero is no mean feat. And I think, the Timorese have learned a lot about self-governance, and some of that journey has been, I guess, becoming disillusioned, like we all are at different times in our political leadership. And, I guess that's a natural progression from, the excitement and the sense of hope and renewal in rebuilding a country. And then there's, I guess, that realization that, there's a whole lot of difficult things to grapple with along the way, including, seeing people, I guess, in the job of leadership for something other than not always noble purposes, and for lining their own pockets, and I guess doing what people see as forgetting what was the motivating force in the times of the resistance, which was, the collective will to defeat a huge and powerful enemy.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. But it's also so exciting to hear about that groundswell, and then perhaps even maybe it's speaking about the new generations coming through, and being critical, having a voice, and standing up, stepping up to the plate. That's a very hopeful thing, a very hopeful story, I think. There's another thing I wanted to ask you about. It's a little bit of a tangent, but just in terms of language, because you yourself, you're well versed in languages. You speak Bahasa, and I'm not even sure how many languages you speak, but and you're fluent in Tetum. I suppose for the audience listening in, this is our first poem that we've done in another language, and of course, if most of the listeners will probably only be English speaking people. Could you tell us a little bit about what we heard? What did we miss? I gave a little the interpretation in English, but what is it about the Tetum language that is beautiful, and what subtleties do we miss in not being able to fully comprehend that language? Or what is there a musicality about Tetum? How do you see the language in its poetic form?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very lyrical, beautiful language, and I think the poem is also. I think all languages have something about them that they are able to express better than in other languages. And in fact, I was talking about that today, because at the moment I'm teaching Tetum online to students from not just around Australia, but around the globe. Actually, I have one student from the UK and 2 from America starting with me tomorrow. And we were just talking about how there's a number of expressions in Tetum that are almost untranslatable. And every language has, those little morsels that are just, unique to that particular language. And I think, poetry, like other works of literature, capture the spirit of a place and a people in a way that's quite unique. So, I translated the poem myself. It took me quite a long time to translate it. It's a difficult thing to translate anything, but I think translating poetry in particular, because there is that quality of lyricism and of, you know, conveying the spirit of a place that's very difficult to capture in words, and particularly translated
I think you did a very good
words.
job, because I think it holds up very well in English, actually. I think as a poem in English, it really spoke to me. But I also hear when it's spoken in Tetum, there's a lyrical quality to it that I don't fully understand, but it's beautiful.
Yeah, and I must commend the lovely woman who read the poem. She did an absolutely beautiful job.
That's great. It was very hard to find someone, actually. It was the normal places I go to hire voiceover artists. There's no Timorese at all on them, so I had to try a whole lot of other avenues. Yeah, but we got there in the end. Yeah. Okay. Well, look, Kirsty, it's been fantastic talking to you, especially after this long period of time I haven't seen you. For viewers out there, last time I think I saw Kirsty was in Timor. We spent some time together, and hospitality in Timor is exceptional. And I would recommend, when things open up, if you've got an opportunity to support, this small country, then go to Dili. Go to Timor. There are so many fantastic opportunities there, and it is just the people are just so beautiful. You'll have an absolutely delightful time.
Well, I would endorse that, and not only are the people amazingly hospitable, but the country is very beautiful. It's got some of the most pristine marine environments in the world. So if you're a diver, snorkeler, hiker, you will love it.
Well, thanks again. And hopefully we'll talk in the future. Thanks,
Wonderful.
Kirsty.
Thanks so much, James.
So it's time to wrap up this week's episode and say goodbye. To support our work, we would really encourage you to subscribe to the Lit Poetry podcast or our YouTube channel. Doing so is the best way that you can support our work. I really hope that you enjoyed this week's discussion, and I'll see you next time.
Foho-Lolon Haklalak, Husi Esteviana Amaral. Mahuen hahu mihis ihai taham belar. Aning horitmu hakmate kase isi. Ia foho tutu marabia. Idilinya fura kanesan fitung yala leham bahira kalanto'o. Ai tahang ihalaletek bali dino lahani haklalak wahira udang monurai. Hafresku matang ihe dia bot. Matang nebe sura holorong. Bai lorong to'o bot hotu laikona. Matang nebe hafresku matang mau to udabeng. Bai lorong tolang fura kotu. Liman sanak sunu no tesi ayar biru. Balada lakonya knuuk no hahufui. Bai hira udan to'o. Belori rai marang iha Foho-Lolon butu kia tetu. Ema balu halerik lakong helafating. Ema balu halerik menus bemos. Balu halerik behahu menus. Selos maksala ihane. Hau. O. Nia. Sira. Imiho ami. Ita sena fating hatudu limang bamalu. Selos maksala. Selos maksehadia.
You've been listening to the Lit Poetry Podcast, presented by James Laidler. For more podcasts, poetry videos, and other useful resources, visit our website at www.litpoetry.com. Thanks for listening.